The doors of the ceremonial hall had barely closed when Elena Voss felt something was wrong. She stood at the altar in a gown stitched with silver thread, her hands cold despite the warmth of 100 candles burning around her. The pack had gathered in silence, waiting for the words that would join her to Damien Cole, the Alpha King of Blackthorn. She had waited 2 years for this moment. She had not expected her heartbeat to feel like a warning bell. Damien stood across from her, tall and composed, his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder. Elena told herself it was nerves. Alphas were not known for showing emotion in front of their pack, and Damien was known least of all for softness. Still, something in the set of his jaw made her stomach twist. The officiant, an older woman named Margaret Hale, lifted the ceremonial cord that would bind their wrists together. She began the opening words of the vow, her voice steady and practiced from years of joining pack members in marriage. Elena reached out her hand, ready to complete the ritual that would make her Luna of Blackthorn. Damien did not move. The room noticed before Elena did. A murmur passed through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Margaret paused mid-sentence, her eyes flicking toward Damien, waiting for him to extend his arm. He did not. Elena's outstretched hand hung in the air a moment too long. She lowered it slowly, glancing at Damien's face, searching for an explanation. What she found instead was his gaze, locked on something behind her, past the rows of pack elders and family members seated in careful formation according to rank. She turned to follow his line of sight. Near the back doors of the hall, half hidden behind a pillar, stood a young woman Elena barely recognized. She wore a plain gray dress, nothing like the formal attire expected of guests at a royal wedding. Her hair was tied back without ornament, and her posture carried the particular smallness of someone who had spent her whole life trying not to be noticed. Elena knew her, vaguely, as an Omega from the lower quarter of the pack territory. Wren Ashford, a name that meant nothing, attached to a rank that meant even less. Damien took a step away from the altar. Gasps rippled through the hall. Margaret Hale's ceremonial cord slipped from her fingers and fell silently to the floor. Elena stood frozen, the silver threading of her gown suddenly feeling too tight, too heavy, as though the dress itself understood what was happening before she did. Damien walked past her. He did not look back. He did not offer an apology or an explanation. He simply walked down the aisle, past his own gathered pack, past the elders who had spent months planning this exact ceremony, past Elena's parents who sat in the front row with matching expressions of pride now curdling into confusion. Wren shrank further behind the pillar as he approached, her eyes wide with something that looked less like triumph and more like fear. She had not asked for this. Elena could see that even from a distance, even through the fog of her own shock, whatever was happening, Wren looked just as blindsided as everyone else in the room. Damien stopped in front of her. He said something too quiet for the rest of the hall to hear, but his body language spoke louder than words. He reached for her hand the way he was supposed to reach for Elena's. Wren flinched, pulling back instinctively, and for one strange moment, it seemed like she might refuse him entirely. Then Damien said something else, and the entire hall went still enough to hear a candle flicker. "She is my fated mate. I will not marry anyone else." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Elena heard them from across the room as clearly as if he had whispered them into her own ear. Fated mate. 2 words that carried more weight in pack law than any contract her family had signed, any alliance they had built, any promise made over the last 2 years of careful courtship and political maneuvering. Elena's father, Victor Voss, rose from his seat so fast his chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. His face had gone the color of ash. "This is an insult," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. "You cannot do this, not here, not in front of everyone." Damien turned, finally, to face the crowd. His expression was not one of triumph or defiance. It was something closer to exhaustion, as though he had spent weeks fighting a decision he no longer had the strength to fight. "I did not choose this," he said. "None of us choose our fated bond. It chose me the moment I caught her scent 3 weeks ago, and I have tried to deny it every day since. I cannot deny it any longer, not at my own wedding, not while lying to a woman who deserves better than a husband already bound to someone else." The words were meant, perhaps as a kind of apology, to Elena, standing alone at the altar in her wedding gown. They felt like nothing more than public humiliation dressed up in noble language. She could feel every eye in the hall turning toward her. Pity. Curiosity. In some corners, barely concealed satisfaction, because not everyone in Blackthorn had wanted this marriage to happen. Rival families who had hoped for a different alliance. Elders who had quietly doubted whether Elena, raised outside the pack's inner circle, truly belonged at Damien's side. Elena's mother reached for her daughter's arm, but Elena stepped back, needing space, needing air, needing anything except the crushing weight of 200 pairs of eyes watching her unravel in real time. Damien. Her own voice sounded foreign to her, thin and distant. Look at me. He did. For the first time since the ceremony began, he actually looked at her, and what she saw in his face was not cruelty. It was regret, sincere and heavy, which somehow made everything worse. She could have handled cruelty. Cruelty she could fight. Regret meant there was no version of this moment where she got to win. I am sorry, Damien said. I know these words mean nothing to you right now, but I could not stand at this altar and lie to you for the rest of both our lives. You could have told me this morning, Elena said. You could have told me last week. You could have told my father before he invited 300 guests to watch you humiliate me. I tried to fight it, Damien said quietly. I did not want this any more than you did, not at first. Fated bonds are not something an alpha can simply set aside because the timing is inconvenient. Ren, still standing beside him, looked as though she wanted to disappear entirely. She had not spoken a single word since the moment Damien crossed the aisle. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor, her shoulders curled inward, and Elena realized with a strange, distant clarity that Ren had not planned this either. Whatever force had drawn Damien away from the altar, it had not asked Ren's permission any more than it had asked Elena's forgiveness. That realization did nothing to soften the sharp edges of the moment. Elena's carefully built future, the title of Luna, the alliance between two pack families, the years of preparation, all of it collapsed in the space of a few sentences spoken by a man who could not look away from another woman. Victor Voss's voice cut through the tension again, colder now, more calculated. This alliance took months to arrange. If you break it here, in front of witnesses, you break more than a wedding. You break the trust between our families. I understand the cost, Damien said. I will find a way to address it, but I will not bind myself to someone I cannot give my whole loyalty to. Elena deserves a husband who chooses her completely, not one who is only half present because his instincts pull him elsewhere. It was, in its own strange way, an act of honesty rare among alphas of his station. It did not make Elena feel any less discarded. The pack elders began speaking among themselves in low, urgent tones. Some looked outraged, glancing toward Ren with open disdain, as though her mere existence had caused this disaster. Others looked thoughtful, weighing the implications of a fated bond against the political fallout of a broken engagement. Fated bonds, after all, were considered sacred under pack law, older and more binding than any contract drawn up by human hands. Elena felt the ground shifting beneath her, the rules of a world she thought she understood rewriting themselves in real time. She had grown up knowing the value of position, of careful alliances, of marriages built to strengthen the pack's future. She had never imagined that all of it could be undone by something as simple, as uncontrollable, as a scent carried on the wind 3 weeks ago. She looked at Ren one more time, searching for anger, for jealousy, for some emotion sharp enough to give her a direction to point her humiliation. Instead, she found only a frightened young woman who looked like she wanted to run out of the hall and never come back. Something about that image stayed with Elena even as she turned and walked back down the aisle alone, her wedding gown trailing behind her like the ghost of a future that no longer existed. She did not cry, not yet. The tears would come later, in private, where no one from Blackthorn could witness the final collapse of the life she had spent 2 years building. Behind her, the hall erupted into a storm of voices, arguments breaking out among the elders, her father's voice rising above the rest as he demanded answers Damien could not fully give. But Elena did not look back. She walked out through the same doors she had entered through less than an hour earlier, still a bride, and stepped into the cold afternoon air as something else entirely. Not a Luna, not a fiancé, just a woman standing alone outside a hall full of people who now saw her as the one left behind. The wind picked up as she reached the courtyard, tugging at the silver threading of her gown, and for the first time since the ceremony began, Elena allowed herself to wonder what exactly she was going to do next. She had no plan. 2 years of preparation had never included a contingency for this. There was no rehearsed line for a bride who had just watched her groom walk toward another woman in front of the entire pack. There was only the cold stone beneath her thin wedding shoes and the distant sound of raised voices still spilling out from the hall behind her. A gardener named Edwin, an older man who had tended the estate grounds for decades, looked up from his work near the courtyard fountain. He had clearly heard something was wrong, though he could not have known the full extent of it. He set down his tools and approached carefully, the way one might approach a startled animal. "Miss Voss," he said gently, "do you need someone to walk with you?" Elena shook her head, though the offer nearly broke the composure she had been fighting to hold since she stepped outside. She did not want company. She wanted silence and distance, and enough time to figure out who she was supposed to be now that the identity she had spent years preparing for no longer existed. "I only need a moment," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Edwin nodded, though he did not fully retreat. He lingered near the fountain, close enough to help if she needed it, far enough to give her the illusion of privacy. Elena appreciated the gesture more than she could say. In a world where everyone inside that hall had just watched her be discarded, a stranger's quiet kindness felt like the only honest thing left. She walked toward the low stone wall at the edge of the courtyard, overlooking the sloped hills that marked the northern border of Blackthorn territory. From here she could see the winding road that led back toward her family's estate, the same road she had traveled that morning with her mother, both of them laughing about small details of the ceremony, neither of them imagining how the day would actually end. Her phone buzzed in the small clutch bag she had set on the wall earlier, forgotten in the chaos of preparing for a wedding that never happened. She looked at the screen and saw a message from her cousin, Grace, who had been unable to attend the ceremony due to a work commitment. The message was simple, cheerful, entirely unaware of what had just occurred. "How did it go? Are you officially Luna yet?" Elena stared at the words for a long moment before setting the phone face down on the stone wall. She was not ready to explain. She was not sure she would ever be ready to explain. Not fully. Not in a way that captured how quickly an entire future could be erased by 2 sentences spoken in front of 300 witnesses. Behind her, the doors of the hall opened again, and Elena turned instinctively, half expecting to see Damien coming to offer some further explanation, some attempt at making the unbearable slightly more bearable. Instead it was her mother, Charlotte Voss, hurrying across the courtyard, with an expression caught somewhere between fury and heartbreak. "Elena." Charlotte reached her daughter and pulled her into an embrace that Elena had not realized she needed until it happened. "I am so sorry. I do not understand what just happened in there." "Neither do I," Elena admitted, her voice finally cracking under the weight of everything she had been holding back. Charlotte pulled back just enough to look at her daughter's face. "Your father is still in there arguing with the elders. He wants to know what compensation Blackthorn intends to offer for this. He is talking about the alliance, about contracts, about everything except how you must be feeling right now." "That sounds like him," Elena said, a bitter edge creeping into her tone despite herself. "What do you want to do?" Charlotte asked. "We can leave right now. We do not have to wait for your father, and we certainly do not have to stay here and listen to any more of this." Elena looked back toward the hall one more time, toward the doors that had closed again, sealing away whatever chaos still unfolded inside. Somewhere in there, Damien was likely trying to manage the political disaster he had created, while Ren stood beside him, thrust into a spotlight she clearly never wanted. Elena felt no desire to go back inside and witness any more of it. "I want to go home," she said quietly. "I do not want to see any of this again today." Charlotte nodded and took her daughter's arm, guiding her away from the courtyard wall toward the waiting cars parked along the estate's private drive. As they walked, Elena allowed herself one final glance back at the ceremonial hall, its tall windows glowing faintly with candlelight from within, the building itself looking almost peaceful despite everything that had just happened inside its walls. She did not yet know how much her life was about to change, or how far the consequences of this single afternoon would reach into the months ahead. She only knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her chest, that nothing about her future would look the way she had planned it, and that somewhere behind those closed doors, a decision had just been made that would reshape the entire pack whether anyone was ready for it or not. Inside the ceremonial hall, the doors had barely closed behind Elena when the room broke into open chaos. Voices rose over one another, elders shouting questions, guests whispering behind raised hands, and somewhere in the middle of it stood Damien Cole, still holding Ren Ashford's trembling hand, as though letting go might undo whatever had just happened. Margaret Hale, the officiant, stood frozen near the abandoned altar, the ceremonial cord still lying where she had dropped it. She had performed hundreds of pack ceremonies over the years, weddings, namings, formal declarations of rank, but nothing had prepared her for a groom abandoning his bride mid-ritual to claim another woman in front of 300 witnesses. Victor Voss pushed his way through the gathering crowd, his face dark with fury barely held in check. He stopped a few feet from Damien, close enough that the younger alphas nearby tensed, ready to intervene if the confrontation turned physical. "You will explain yourself," Victor said, his voice low and controlled in the way of a man used to being obeyed. "In front of everyone who witnessed what you just did." Damien did not release Ren's hand, though he turned to face Victor fully, his posture straightening into something more befitting an Alpha King than the uncertain figure who had crossed the aisle moments earlier. "I already explained it," Damien said. "Ren is my fated mate. I recognized her scent 3 weeks ago, and I have spent every day since trying to convince myself that duty could overrule instinct. I was wrong to try. I was wrong to let this ceremony proceed as long as it did, without telling your daughter the truth." "You could have told her privately," Victor snapped. "You could have ended the engagement quietly, without turning it into a spectacle that will be discussed in every pack territory by morning." "I know," Damien admitted, and for a moment, something like shame flickered across his face. "I kept hoping the pull would fade. Fated bonds are rare enough that I did not fully believe it was happening to me until I stood at that altar and realized I could not go through with binding myself to someone else, while every part of me was fixed on a woman standing in the back of the room." Beside him, Ren finally found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "I did not ask for this. I did not come here expecting anything except to watch a wedding like everyone else." Her words did little to calm the room. If anything, several of the elders turned their attention toward her with expressions that ranged from suspicion to open hostility. An elder named Harold Ferris, one of the most senior members of the Pack Council, stepped forward, his cane tapping sharply against the stone floor. "An Omega," Harold said, not quite hiding his disdain, claiming the attention of an Alpha King, on the very day he was meant to marry someone of proper rank. "Forgive me if I find the timing difficult to accept as pure coincidence." "It is not a claim," Damien said sharply, his tone hardening. "Ren has said nothing to encourage this. She did not seek me out. I sought her, because the bond does not ask permission from either of us. If you have complaints about how pack instincts work, take them up with nature, not with her." Harold's jaw tightened, but he did not press further, at least not directly. Instead, he turned to address the other elders gathered nearby. "The council will need to discuss what this means for the alliance with the Voss family, and what it means for the succession line if the Alpha King intends to elevate an unranked Omega to the position of Luna." The word succession seemed to ripple through the crowd with particular weight. Blackthorn's stability depended on clear lines of authority, and an unexpected change in who stood beside the Alpha King carried consequences far beyond a single broken engagement. Ren's grip on Damien's hand tightened, and he glanced down at her, seeing the fear plainly written across her face. She looked utterly unprepared for the position she had just been placed in, thrust from a quiet, unnoticed life into the center of a political storm she had never asked to be part of. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion somewhere more private," Damien said, addressing Harold and the assembled elders. "Nothing productive will come from arguing in front of the remaining guests." "The remaining guests already witnessed the important part," Harold said dryly. "Whatever we discuss now is simply cleanup." Despite the sharpness of his tone, Harold gestured toward a side chamber often used for council meetings, and the senior members of the pack began filing toward it, casting glances back at Damien and Ren as they went. Damien finally released Ren's hand long enough to speak quietly to her, his voice softer than anything he had used since the ceremony began. "I know this is not what you wanted," he said. "I know I have placed you in a position you never asked for. I will not pretend that makes it easier for you, but I need you to trust that I will not let the council treat you unfairly because of your rank." Ren looked up at him, her expression caught between gratitude and overwhelming uncertainty. "Everyone in that hall just watched you choose me over the woman you were supposed to marry. I do not know how to trust that this will not follow me for the rest of my life." "It might," Damien admitted honestly, "but I would rather face difficulty standing beside someone the bond chose than spend my life pretending contentment beside someone it did not." A younger pack member, a beta named Nathan Price, who had been assigned to assist with wedding logistics, approached hesitantly, clearly unsure whether his duties still applied to a ceremony that no longer existed in any recognizable form. "Alpha King," he said carefully, "should I begin dismissing the remaining guests, or does the council wish for everyone to stay while decisions are made?" "Dismiss them," Damien said. "There is no reason for the rest of the pack to stand here while we sort out the details." Nathan nodded and moved quickly to relay the message, grateful for a task that removed him from the tension building near the altar. Guests began filing out in low murmuring clusters, casting curious glances toward Ren as they passed, some sympathetic, most simply hungry for details they could later share with others who had not been present. Damien guided Ren toward the side chamber where the elders waited, his hand resting lightly at her back in a gesture meant to offer reassurance rather than control. She walked with visible reluctance, her shoulders drawn tight, clearly aware that whatever waited inside that room would determine far more about her future than she felt prepared to handle. The chamber itself was smaller than the main hall, wood-paneled and lined with portraits of past Blackthorn leaders stretching back generations. Harold Ferris sat at the head of a long table, flanked by 3 other senior elders, their expressions uniformly grim. Damien took a seat across from them, gesturing for Wren to sit beside him, despite the obvious discomfort rippling through the room at an Omega being given a seat at the council table at all. "Let us be direct," Harold said, folding his hands atop the table. "Fated bonds are recognized under pack law. No one here disputes that, but recognition of a bond does not automatically grant the right to elevate someone to Luna without council approval, particularly when the individual in question has no formal training, no political connections, and no experience managing the responsibilities that position requires. She has 3 weeks to prepare, since that is how long I have known about the bond," Damien said. "I am aware that is not much time. I am asking the council to allow her that time, rather than dismissing her outright because of circumstances neither of us controlled." "And the Voss family?" another elder asked. "Do we simply allow that alliance to collapse without consequence? Victor Voss will not accept this quietly. He has already spoken of compensation, and I suspect he intends to pursue every available option to protect his family's standing after this humiliation." "I will address Victor Voss personally," Damien said. "I do not intend to let this fracture relations between our families beyond repair, if it can be avoided, but I cannot undo the bond simply because its timing was inconvenient for an alliance built around a wedding that was never going to happen the moment I recognized Wren's scent." Harold studied Damien for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he turned his attention to Wren, who had remained silent throughout most of the exchange, clearly uncertain whether speaking would help or hurt her position. "And you," Harold said. "What do you want from this? Do you seek the title of Luna, the power that comes with it, the influence over pack decisions?" Wren shook her head slowly. "I did not come here today wanting any of this. I came to watch a wedding, the same as everyone else. I do not know how to be Luna. I barely know how to explain what happened between me and Damien these past 3 weeks, because I have spent most of that time trying to convince myself it was not real." Her honesty seemed to catch the elders off guard, several exchanging glances that suggested her answer had not been what they expected. Harold's expression softened, though only slightly. "At least she is honest," he said, addressing the other elders rather than Wren directly. "Whether honesty is enough to manage the responsibilities of Luna remains to be seen." "Give her the chance to show what she can do," Damien said. "That is all I am asking. Not immediate acceptance, not blind trust, simply the opportunity to prove herself before the council makes any final judgment." The elders exchanged another round of glances, quiet conversation passing between them without words, the kind of silent negotiation that came from decades of working together on pack matters. Finally Harold nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "We will allow a period of observation," he said. 3 months, during which the Omega will be expected to demonstrate she understands the responsibilities of her potential position. At the end of that period, the council will vote on whether to formally recognize her as Luna. Until then, she remains under scrutiny, and any misstep will be considered carefully. Damien exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. It was not the outcome he had hoped for, full and immediate acceptance, but it was far better than outright rejection. Beside him, Wren looked overwhelmed by the weight of what had just been decided on her behalf. 3 months that would determine the entire shape of her future. As the meeting drew to a close and the elders began filing out of the chamber, Harold paused at the doorway, looking back at Wren with an expression that carried more warning than welcome. 3 months, he repeated. "Do not waste them." The door closed behind him, leaving Damien and Wren alone in the quiet chamber, the weight of everything that had just happened settling heavily around them both. Wren pressed her palms flat against the wooden table, steadying herself against a wave of dizziness that had been building since the moment Damien first reached for her hand in front of the entire pack. 3 months. The number felt both impossibly long and impossibly short, a stretch of time in which she would need to learn skills she had never been taught, navigate politics she barely understood, and somehow convince an entire pack that she deserved a position she had never wanted in the first place. "I do not know how to do any of this," she admitted quietly, her voice small in the emptying chamber. "I have never sat at a council table. I have never managed anything larger than my own small household. How am I supposed to prove I understand the responsibilities of Luna when I do not even understand them myself?" Damien moved to sit beside her, closer now that the elders had gone and the formal tension of the meeting had eased. You will learn. I will help you learn. This is not something you have to figure out alone. Everyone in that hall is going to talk about this, Ren said. By tomorrow, every pack territory within 100 miles will know that an unranked Omega interrupted the Alpha King's wedding. They are not going to see someone worth teaching. They are going to see someone who does not belong. Let them talk, Damien said, though even he could hear how little comfort the words offered. What matters is what you actually do over these next 3 months, not what people assume about you before you have had the chance to prove otherwise. Ren said nothing for a long moment, staring at the grain of the wooden table, as though it might offer some answer neither of them had considered. Finally she looked up at him, her expression steadier than it had been throughout the entire ordeal. I need to go home, she said. I need time to think, away from council chambers and elders and everyone who watched this happen. Can you understand that? Of course, Damien said, standing to walk her toward the chamber door. I will send someone to check on you this evening, if that is acceptable. It is, Ren said, though her tone carried more exhaustion than enthusiasm. They walked together through the now empty ceremonial hall, the candles that had burned so brightly during the failed wedding now flickering low, casting long shadows across the abandoned altar and the ceremonial cord still lying forgotten on the floor. Ren paused near the doorway, looking back at the space where her life had changed so irreversibly in the span of a single afternoon. Outside, the courtyard had mostly emptied of guests, though a few lingering pack members glanced her way as she passed, their expressions ranging from curious to openly unfriendly. One woman, an Omega named Priscilla who worked in the pack's textile hall alongside Ren, caught her eye briefly before looking away without offering any acknowledgement. Ren felt the sting of it more sharply than she expected. Whatever had happened between her and Damien, she was still the same person who had worked alongside these people for years, and already they were treating her differently. Damien walked her as far as the edge of the estate grounds, where a car waited to take her back to the modest home she shared with her aunt in the pack's lower quarter. Before she climbed in, he caught her hand gently, his expression unusually vulnerable for a man who commanded an entire territory. I know I have upended your life without asking, he said. I know that is not fair to you. But I could not stand at that altar and pretend the bond did not exist. I hope, eventually, you will understand why. Ren studied his face for a long moment, searching for something she could not quite name. I do not fully understand it now, she said honestly, but I am willing to try to understand it, if you are willing to be patient while I figure out what any of this means for me. I can be patient, Damien said. She nodded, offering the faintest hint of a smile before climbing into the car. As it pulled away down the long drive, Damien remained standing at the edge of the estate grounds, watching until the vehicle disappeared around the bend, uncertain whether the path ahead led toward something worth the chaos of this day, or toward a disaster far larger than anything the pack had yet witnessed. Behind him, inside the estate, the whispers had already begun, carried from guest to guest, from pack member to pack member, spreading outward like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. By morning, the story of the wedding that never happened would reach every corner of Blackthorn territory, and soon after, every neighboring pack would know that the Alpha King had chosen an unranked Omega over the daughter of one of his most powerful allies. Whatever came next, Damien understood there would be no quiet path forward. The council had granted Ren 3 months, but the pack itself, the wider world beyond that chamber, would not wait so patiently for its questions to be answered. By the time Elena reached her family's estate, the sun had already dipped low behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange that felt almost mocking given the events of the afternoon. She had removed her wedding gown somewhere along the drive, changing into simple clothes her mother had thankfully packed in the car, as though some part of Charlotte Voss had anticipated needing an exit plan. The estate itself felt different walking through it now, the same halls and rooms that had spent months buzzing with wedding preparations now silent and strangely hollow. Elena climbed the stairs to her childhood bedroom, the one she had left just that morning as a bride full of nervous excitement, and sat on the edge of her bed feeling like a stranger in a room that no longer matched who she had become in the span of a single day. A knock at her door came sooner than she expected. She assumed it would be her mother, checking on her the way she had promised in the car, but when she opened the door it was her father standing there instead, his expression carrying none of the warmth Charlotte had shown. We need to discuss what happens next, Victor said, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. Elena closed her eyes briefly, gathering whatever strength she had left. Can this wait until tomorrow? I have had a difficult day. Everyone in this territory has had a difficult day, Victor said. The difference is that most of them get to go home and forget about it eventually. We do not have that luxury. This family's standing depends on how we respond to what happened this afternoon. I was humiliated in front of 300 people, Elena said, her voice sharper than she intended. Forgive me if my first concern is not the family's standing. Victor's expression tightened, though he did not raise his voice. Your standing and the family's standing have never been separate things, Elena. You know that. Everything we built toward this marriage, every connection, every favor called in, every alliance strengthened, all of it depended on you becoming Luna of Blackthorn. That opportunity is gone now, and we need to determine how to salvage what remains. Elena stared at her father, something cold settling in her chest as she absorbed the full weight of what he was actually saying. Not concern for her well-being, not comfort for the humiliation she had endured. Only calculation, the same calculation that had shaped every major decision in her life since childhood. Is that all I am to you? She asked quietly. A piece to be positioned for the family's benefit. Do not be dramatic, Victor said. I am simply being realistic about what this family needs right now. We have spent significant resources preparing for this alliance. Blackthorn owes us compensation, at minimum, for the humiliation their Alpha King caused. I intend to pursue that, regardless of what happens between you and Damien going forward. There is nothing happening between me and Damien going forward, Elena said. He made that abundantly clear this afternoon. Victor waved a hand dismissively, as though the specifics of her broken engagement were merely a minor obstacle to work around, rather than the central wound of her day. Fated bonds have been overturned before, under the right circumstances. It would not be unprecedented for the council to reconsider, particularly if the Omega proves unfit for the responsibilities of Luna. We should not assume this situation is permanent. Elena felt something inside her harden at her father's words. You want me to wait around hoping Damien changes his mind? Or hoping Ren fails badly enough that the council rejects her? That is not a plan, father. That is humiliation stretched out over months instead of concentrated into a single afternoon. It is strategy, Victor corrected. Something you would benefit from understanding better, given how much of your future still depends on this family's position within pack politics. My future, Elena repeated, standing now, unable to remain seated while her father spoke about her life as though it were a business transaction, awaiting the right market conditions. You have not once asked how I am feeling since I walked through that door, not once. You walked in here talking about compensation and strategy before you even acknowledged what happened to me today. Victor's expression flickered, something almost like discomfort passing across his face before it hardened again into the composed mask he wore for pack business. I am aware of what happened to you today, Elena. I was standing in that hall, but dwelling on feelings will not restore this family's standing, nor will it undo the damage caused by Damien's choice. Someone in this family needs to think clearly about what comes next, and given the state you are in, it does not appear that person will be you. The words landed harder than Elena expected, a quiet confirmation of something she had suspected for years but never allowed herself to fully acknowledge. Her value to her father had always been tied to what she could accomplish for the family's standing, first through her education, then through carefully chosen social connections, and finally through this marriage that was supposed to cement Blackthorn's alliance with the Voss family for generations. Get out, she said quietly. Elena, get out, she repeated, louder this time. I do not want to discuss strategy tonight. I do not want to discuss compensation or council votes or whether Ren Ashford might fail at a position she never asked for. I want to be left alone. Victor studied her for a long moment, and for a moment Elena thought he might finally soften, might finally acknowledge the emotional wreckage of her day rather than its political implications. Instead, he simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and turned to leave the room. We will discuss this further when you have had time to calm down, he said, closing the door behind him without waiting for a response. Elena sat back down on the edge of her bed, the silence of the room pressing in around her, now that her father's presence had gone. She had expected grief over the loss of her engagement. She had expected humiliation over the public nature of her rejection. She had not expected the sharper, quieter pain of realizing exactly how her own father viewed her, a piece on a board to be moved according to whatever strategy best served the family's interests. A soft knock came again sometime later, this one gentler, and when Elena opened the door she found her mother standing there instead, holding 2 cups of tea, her expression carrying none of Victor's cold calculation. I heard raised voices, Charlotte said, stepping into the room and setting the tea down on the small table near the window. I assume your father came to discuss strategy rather than comfort. You assumed correctly, Elena said, some of the tension leaving her shoulders now that someone in this house seemed capable of understanding what she actually needed. Charlotte sat beside her on the bed, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders. I am sorry, Elena, for all of it. You did not deserve what happened today, and you certainly do not deserve to come home and be treated like a chess piece the moment you walk through the door. Did you know he was going to talk about compensation? Elena asked, before I even had a chance to process what happened. I suspected, Charlotte admitted. Your father has always thought in those terms. It does not mean he does not care about you, Elena, but he shows it in ways that often feel less like care and more like management. It feels the same either way, Elena said quietly. It feels like I only matter as much as I am useful. Charlotte pulled her daughter closer, her expression pained. That is not true, even if your father struggles to show it properly, but I understand why today would make you feel that way, given everything that happened. They sat together in silence for a while, the tea slowly cooling on the table beside them, the events of the afternoon settling into something Elena would need to carry with her regardless of whatever came next. Eventually Charlotte spoke again, her voice careful and measured. What do you want to do, Elena? Not what your father wants, not what the family's standing requires. What do you actually want? Elena considered the question longer than she expected to need. 2 years of her life had been built around becoming Luna of Blackthorn, a role that no longer existed for her, a future that had been erased in the span of a single ceremony. She had no immediate answer, no clear direction forward, only the certainty that she did not want to spend the coming months waiting quietly for Damien to change his mind, or hoping for Ren's failure to reopen a door she was no longer sure she wanted walked through. I do not know yet, she admitted finally, but I know I do not want to be part of my father's strategy. Whatever I decide, it needs to be mine. Charlotte squeezed her daughter's hand, a small, sad smile crossing her face. That sounds like a good place to start. Outside the window, the last light of evening faded into darkness, and somewhere across the Pack territory, word of the day's events continued spreading from household to household, reshaping how an entire community would view both Elena and the woman who had unknowingly taken her place. Sleep did not come easily that night. Elena lay awake for hours, replaying the ceremony over and over, searching for some detail she might have missed, some sign that could have warned her before she stood at that altar in front of everyone she knew. She found nothing new, only the same sequence of events playing out again and again, until exhaustion finally pulled her under sometime near dawn. She woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through her window, and a strange, unfamiliar quiet in the house. Her father had already left for early meetings with Pack officials, likely continuing his campaign for compensation, regardless of Elena's feelings on the matter. Her mother had left a note on the kitchen table, promising to return by afternoon after running errands in the lower quarter. Elena sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she barely touched, her mind circling back again and again to one particular detail from the previous day. Ren Ashford, a name she had heard only in passing before yesterday, attached to a face she barely recognized despite having lived in the same Pack territory for her entire life. Who was this woman, really? Elena realized she knew almost nothing about her, only the barest fact of her existence as an unranked Omega working somewhere in the Pack's lower quarter. She had spent an entire evening imagining Ren as some kind of calculating rival, someone who had perhaps orchestrated this entire situation to elevate her own standing within the Pack. But the image did not match what Elena had actually witnessed in that hall, a woman who looked as frightened and overwhelmed as anyone could be, thrust into a spotlight she clearly never sought. The uncertainty gnawed at Elena throughout the morning, until finally she made a decision that surprised even herself. She would seek out information about Ren, not to plot revenge or find ammunition for some future confrontation, but simply because she needed to understand the person who had unknowingly upended her entire life. Sitting at home stewing in humiliation felt unbearable, and doing something, anything, felt infinitely better than waiting passively for her father's next strategy session. She dressed simply and drove toward the lower quarter of the Pack territory, an area she had visited only rarely growing up, mostly during charity events her family sponsored for public appearances rather than genuine engagement with the community living there. The streets grew narrower as she drove, the houses smaller and closer together, a stark contrast to the sprawling estate she had grown up in. She stopped at a small shop near the center of the quarter, hoping to ask discreet questions without drawing too much attention to herself. The shopkeeper, an older woman named Ruth Bellamy, looked up as Elena entered, her expression shifting quickly from polite greeting to recognition as she placed the face of the woman who had been so publicly humiliated the day before. Miss Voss, Ruth said carefully, clearly unsure how to proceed given the circumstances. I did not expect to see you here. I am looking for some information, Elena said, deciding directness was likely her best approach. About Wren Ashford. Do you know her? Ruth's expression grew wary, and for a moment Elena worried the shopkeeper would refuse to speak with her entirely, assuming she had come seeking some kind of confrontation or revenge. I know of her, Ruth said finally. Everyone in the lower quarter knows everyone else, more or less. Why do you want to know about her? I am not here to cause trouble, Elena said, hearing how unconvincing the words sounded even as she spoke them. I just want to understand what happened yesterday. I want to understand who she is. Ruth studied Elena for a long moment before setting down the cloth she had been using to clean the shop counter. Wren has lived in this quarter her entire life. Her parents passed when she was young, some kind of accident, though I do not remember the full details. She was raised by her aunt, a woman named Constance who works at the Pack Laundry Hall. Wren herself has worked various odd jobs over the years, nothing glamorous, nothing that would suggest she was seeking any kind of elevated position within the pack. Did she know Damien before yesterday? Elena asked. Had they met before whatever happened between them 3 weeks ago? Ruth shrugged. Not that I am aware of. Wren keeps to herself mostly. She is not the type to seek attention. Quite the opposite. I was as surprised as anyone to hear what happened at the ceremony. The information did little to satisfy the deeper questions circling in Elena's mind, but it confirmed something she had already begun to suspect. Wren had not orchestrated this situation for personal gain. Whatever had happened between her and Damien, it had not come from calculated ambition on Wren's part. Thank you, Elena said, turning to leave the shop, though Ruth's voice stopped her before she reached the door. Miss Voss, Ruth said. For what it is worth, I do not think Wren wanted any part of what happened yesterday. I have known her for years. She has never once shown interest in rising above her rank, never once expressed any ambition toward the kind of life that comes with being Luna. Whatever pulled the Alpha King toward her, I do not believe it was something she sought out. Elena nodded slowly, absorbing the words even as part of her resisted accepting them fully. It would have been easier, in some ways, to hate Wren as a scheming opportunist who had stolen her future through calculated manipulation. The truth, apparently, was far messier and far harder to direct her anger toward. She left the shop and walked slowly back toward her car, the narrow streets of the lower quarter feeling suddenly heavier with the knowledge she now carried. Somewhere in this same neighborhood, Wren Ashford was likely grappling with her own version of yesterday's chaos, thrust into a position of scrutiny and judgment she had never sought, facing a pack that would watch her every move for the next 3 months with skeptical, unforgiving eyes. Elena climbed into her car and sat for a long moment before starting the engine, staring out at the modest houses lining the street, wondering what exactly she was supposed to feel now that her simple narrative of villain and victim had grown far more complicated than she expected. Whatever came next, she realized, would require more than simple anger to navigate. It would require understanding, however reluctant, of a woman she had never wanted to know anything about at all. Wren sat at the small kitchen table in her aunt's house, staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago. The house felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in around her as she replayed the events of the previous day, still struggling to reconcile the quiet life she had built for herself with the chaos that had erupted in the ceremonial hall. Her Aunt Constance moved around the small kitchen, tidying dishes that did not need tidying, clearly trying to find some way to offer comfort without overwhelming her niece with too many questions. Constance had raised Wren since she was 8 years old, taking in her sister's daughter without hesitation after the accident that claimed both of Wren's parents during a supply run near the northern border. You do not have to talk about it if you are not ready, Constance said finally, sitting across from Wren at the table. But I imagine it might help to say some of it out loud. Wren wrapped her hands around the cold teacup, needing something to hold on to. I keep trying to understand how this happened. 3 weeks ago, I was working the same shifts I have worked for years, coming home to the same house, living the same quiet life. Now the entire pack knows my name, and most of them seem to hate me for something I never asked for. Tell me about 3 weeks ago, Constance said gently. When did you first notice something was different? Wren closed her eyes, pulling the memory into focus. I was walking home from the textile hall, later than usual because we had fallen behind on an order. I passed near the northern market square, and I caught a scent that stopped me completely. I did not understand it at first. It felt overwhelming, familiar somehow, though I could not place why. She opened her eyes, meeting her aunt's patient gaze. I looked up and saw him standing across the square, staring at me the same way I imagine I was staring at him. Neither of us said anything. He just looked at me like he recognized something, and then he turned and walked away without a word. And after that? Constance asked. It happened again. A few days later, near the same market, and then again after that. Each time neither of us spoke, but the pull only grew stronger. I did not understand what was happening until I finally worked up the courage to ask one of the older women at the textile hall, and she explained what a faded bond scent recognition actually felt like. Constance nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Did you ever consider telling anyone before yesterday? Warning someone, perhaps, about what you suspected was happening? Wren shook her head. Who would I have told? Damien was engaged to marry someone of proper rank, someone the entire pack expected to become the next Luna. I assumed the bond, whatever it was, would fade, or that he would find a way to ignore it entirely. I never imagined he would actually act on it, especially not at his own wedding, in front of everyone. The memory of the ceremony flashed through her mind again, the moment Damien's eyes had locked onto hers from across the crowded hall, the moment he had turned away from his bride and walked toward her instead. She had wanted to disappear in that moment, wanted the floor to open and swallow her whole, rather than become the center of attention for something she had never sought.
There is something else,
Wren said quietly, a memory surfacing that she had not fully processed until this moment. When I first caught his scent that day in the market, something about it felt familiar in a way that went beyond the bond itself, like I had encountered it before, a long time ago, though I could not place where. Constance's expression shifted subtly, something almost knowing in her eyes. Do you remember anything from your childhood involving the Cole family, before your parents passed, or shortly after? Wren frowned, trying to pull old memories forward through the fog of years. I remember very little from before I came to live with you, mostly fragments. Why do you ask? Constance hesitated, choosing her words carefully. There was an incident, when you were very young, perhaps 6 or 7 years old. Your parents had taken you to a gathering near the eastern woods, some kind of harvest festival the pack used to hold before the tradition faded. You wandered off from the group, as children sometimes do, and got lost among the trees. I do not remember that at all, Wren said, though something in her aunt's description tugged uncomfortably at the edges of her memory, a sensation rather than a clear recollection. You were found eventually, unharmed, though quite frightened, Constance continued. The details were never entirely clear to me, since I was not present myself, but I remember your mother telling me that a young boy, an unranked heir from the Cole family at the time, had found you wandering alone and stayed with you until the search party arrived. He could not have been more than 9 or 10 years old himself, hardly old enough to understand the significance of what he was doing, but he refused to leave your side until you were safely returned to your parents. Wren sat perfectly still, absorbing this fragment of history she had never known existed. Damien, she said slowly. You think that boy was Damien Cole? I cannot say for certain, Constance admitted. It was many years ago, and I never learned the boy's name at the time. But given what you have described about the familiarity of his scent, and given that the timeline would match roughly with Damien's age, it does not seem impossible. The revelation settled over Wren with strange, disorienting weight. If true, it meant the bond between her and Damien was not some random, inexplicable pull that had emerged from nothing, but something rooted in a connection formed decades earlier, buried so deep in both their memories that neither had consciously recognized it until their sense reawakened whatever had been dormant since childhood. Why would neither of us remember something like that clearly? Wren asked. If it truly happened the way you described, surely it would have left some lasting impression. Children forget things more easily than adults sometimes assume, Constance said. Especially frightening experiences that resolve safely. You were found unharmed and returned to your parents. There would have been little reason for the memory to stay vivid, particularly as you grew older, and other, more significant events shaped your understanding of the world, including the loss of your parents not long after. Wren considered this, turning the possibility over in her mind. Had some part of her recognized Damien the moment their paths crossed in the market square? Some buried instinct reaching back through years of forgotten childhood, rather than a bond forming entirely from nothing? The idea felt both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it suggested some deeper meaning behind the chaos of recent weeks. Unsettling because it meant the connection between them ran deeper and further back than either of them had realized. Does this change anything? Wren asked, though she was not entirely sure what answer she hoped to hear. Constance reached across the table and took her niece's hand. I do not know, Wren, but I think it might explain something about why the bond felt so immediate, so overwhelming, rather than the gradual attraction people sometimes describe when fated mates first meet as adults. Whatever connection existed between you and Damien may have been forming since you were children, long before either of you understood what a fated bond even meant. The conversation left Ren with more questions than answers, though it did shift something in how she understood her own situation. She was no longer simply an Omega who had accidentally disrupted a wedding through unfortunate timing. She was, perhaps, someone whose connection to Damien Cole stretched back further than either of them had known, rooted in a moment of childhood kindness neither had consciously remembered until fate, or instinct, or something harder to name, had drawn them back together. Later that evening, a knock came at the door, and Ren opened it to find one of Damien's household staff, a young man carrying a folder of documents and a formal request for her to attend a private meeting with the Alpha King the following morning. The Pack Council's 3-month observation period had officially begun, and already the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on Ren with renewed intensity. She closed the door after accepting the documents, returning to the kitchen table where her aunt still sat waiting. "It has already started," Ren said quietly. "The observation, the scrutiny, all of it." Constance reached out and squeezed her niece's hand once more, her expression steady despite the uncertainty ahead. "Then you will simply have to show them who you actually are, Ren. Not the rumors, not the assumptions, not the fears of elders who have already decided what an Omega is capable of before giving you the chance to prove otherwise. Just yourself." Ren nodded, though the weight of the coming months settled heavily across her shoulders as she stared down at the documents in her hands, wondering how she was possibly meant to prove herself worthy of a position she had never sought, in front of a pack that had already made up its mind about who she must be. The next morning arrived too quickly. Ren dressed carefully in the plainest formal clothing she owned, aware that whatever she wore would likely be scrutinized alongside everything else about her, and made her way to the Cole estate for the meeting Damien had requested. The drive from the lower quarter to the estate felt longer than she remembered, the modest houses of her neighborhood gradually giving way to the larger, more elaborate homes of the pack's ranked families. A staff member greeted her at the entrance, a woman named Isabel Farrow who managed much of the estate's daily operations. Isabel's expression remained carefully neutral, though Ren could sense the underlying tension in how she was received, polite enough to avoid outright rudeness, distant enough to make clear that acceptance was far from guaranteed. "The Alpha King is waiting in the East Study," Isabel said, leading Ren through hallways lined with portraits of Cole family members stretching back generations. Ren felt distinctly out of place amid the grandeur, aware of every worn edge on her simple clothing, compared to the polished elegance surrounding her. Damien rose from his desk when she entered the study, his expression softening slightly at the sight of her, though the formality of the space kept some distance between them that had not existed the previous evening. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I imagine this is not how you expected to spend your morning." "Nothing about the past 2 days has matched what I expected," Ren said, taking the seat he offered across from his desk. Damien nodded, understanding evident in his expression. "I have arranged for someone to begin working with you on the basics of pack governance, protocol, and the responsibilities expected of a Luna. It will not be easy, and I will not pretend the elders will make this process gentle, but I want you to have every advantage available to prove yourself over these next 3 months." "Who will be teaching me?" Ren asked. "A woman named Grace Whitfield," Damien said. "She served as an advisor to my mother years ago, before she stepped back from formal duties. She has agreed to work with you directly, given the unusual circumstances." As if summoned by the mention of her name, a knock came at the study door, and an older woman entered, her posture radiating the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of navigating pack politics. Grace Whitfield studied Ren with sharp, assessing eyes, though her expression carried none of the open hostility Ren had braced herself for. "So you are the young woman who has turned this entire pack upside down," Grace said, though her tone carried more curiosity than judgment. "Sit up straight, dear. If you are going to survive the next 3 months, you will need to look like you belong in every room you enter, whether you feel that way or not." Ren straightened instinctively, and something in Grace's brisk, businesslike manner actually put her more at ease than any gentler approach might have. Here, at least, was someone treating this situation as a problem to be solved rather than a scandal to be endlessly discussed. "We will begin today," Grace continued, "with the basics of pack council structure, so you understand exactly who you will be dealing with over the coming months, and what motivates each of their positions. Understanding your opponents is the first step toward not being caught off guard by them again." Damien offered Ren a small, encouraging smile as Grace gestured for her to follow toward a smaller meeting room down the hall. clearly prepared to begin the lessons immediately. Ren rose from her seat, gathering whatever composure she could manage, aware that the next 3 months would test her in ways she had never been tested before. As she followed Grace from the study, she caught a final glimpse of Damien returning to his desk, his expression troubled despite his attempts to appear reassuring. Whatever quiet confidence he projected for her benefit, Ren suspected he understood better than anyone exactly how difficult the road ahead would be, not just for her, but for the entire pack now forced to reckon with a decision that had upended generations of careful tradition in a single, unplanned moment. Over the following weeks, Blackthorn Pack settled into an uneasy division that touched nearly every household within its territory. Conversations at the market, at council meetings, even among children playing in the streets, seemed to circle back eventually to the same question. Did the Alpha King have the right to abandon his arranged marriage for the sake of a fated bond with an unranked Omega? Or had he betrayed generations of careful pack tradition for the sake of something as fleeting as instinct? The traditionalists, led quietly by Elder Harold Ferris, argued that hierarchy existed for good reason, that pack stability depended on leaders who understood duty above personal desire. They pointed to Ren's lack of experience, her unfamiliarity with governance, as evidence that the entire situation threatened the structural integrity that had kept Blackthorn strong for generations. Others, particularly younger pack members who had grown weary of rigid rank distinctions, saw the situation differently. They viewed Damien's choice as evidence that fated bonds superseded arbitrary social hierarchy, that perhaps the pack's obsession with rank had grown outdated in a world that increasingly valued individual character over inherited status. Elena found herself an unwilling spectator to these debates, her name invoked constantly in arguments she had no desire to participate in. She had grown tired of being treated as a symbol of wrong tradition by one faction and a relic of outdated hierarchy by another, when in truth she felt like neither, simply a woman trying to rebuild some sense of direction after watching her carefully planned future collapse in a single afternoon. It was during this period of uncertainty that Marcus Cade first approached her. She had heard the name before, vaguely, associated with the Cade Pack territory that bordered Blackthorn's eastern edge, a rival alpha known for his ambition and his willingness to exploit weakness wherever he found it. She had never expected him to seek her out personally. The meeting happened almost by accident, or so it seemed at the time. Elena had gone to a small cafe near the border of the two territories, seeking distance from the constant whispers following her through Blackthorn's streets. She was seated alone, nursing a cup of tea she had barely touched, when a well-dressed man approached her table with an easy, confident smile. "Miss Voss," he said, extending a hand she did not immediately take. "Marcus Cade. I apologize for the intrusion, but I could not help noticing you sitting here alone, and I thought perhaps you might appreciate company from someone who understands, at least in part, what you have recently endured." Elena studied him warily, recognizing the name immediately despite never having met him before. "I am not certain what you mean by understanding what I have endured, Alpha Cade. Please call me Marcus," he said, seating himself across from her without waiting for explicit permission. "And I mean simply that public humiliation at the hands of powerful men is not an experience unique to you. I have witnessed similar dynamics play out in my own territory over the years, though rarely with such dramatic staging as what occurred at your ceremony." Elena felt a flush of embarrassment at the reminder, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "If you have come here to discuss my humiliation for your own amusement, I would prefer you leave." "Not at all," Marcus said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "I have come because I believe Damien Cole's decision was not merely a personal failing but a political vulnerability, one that could prove useful to those of us who have long sought greater influence over Blackthorn's territory." Elena's wariness sharpened into genuine alarm. "You are suggesting I help you exploit what happened to me for some kind of territorial advantage?" "I am suggesting," Marcus said carefully, "that you and I share an interest in seeing Damien Cole's position weakened. You for reasons of personal grievance, myself for reasons of strategic opportunity. There is no shame in acknowledging that shared interests sometimes create useful alliances, regardless of how those interests originated. And what exactly would this alliance require of me?" Elena asked, though part of her recognized the danger in even entertaining the question. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression carrying the particular intensity of someone accustomed to negotiating from a position of confidence. "Information, primarily. Insight into Blackthorn's internal divisions, details about how the Council views the situation with the Omega, anything that might help me understand where fractures already exist within Damien's leadership. In exchange, I would ensure that your family's standing suffers no lasting damage from this humiliation, and I would personally see to it that Damian Cole faces meaningful consequences for the disrespect he showed you. Elena studied him carefully, weighing the offer against everything she understood about pack politics and the dangerous game Marcus seemed to be proposing. You are talking about destabilizing an entire pack territory, Alpha Cade. That is not a small thing to propose over tea. I am talking about correcting an imbalance that already exists, Marcus said smoothly. Blackthorn's leadership has shown itself to be unstable, willing to abandon careful alliances for the sake of momentary instinct. Such instability creates opportunity for those prepared to act on it. I would simply prefer that opportunity be managed carefully, with minimal disruption, rather than allowed to develop chaotically on its own. The words carried a veneer of reasonableness that Elena found deeply unsettling, precisely because part of her, the part still raw and humiliated from the events of the wedding, felt tempted by the promise of seeing Damian face consequences for what he had done. But something about Marcus's easy confidence, his willingness to exploit her pain for calculated political gain, made her deeply uneasy. I need time to think about this, she said finally, unwilling to commit to anything without understanding the full scope of what Marcus was actually proposing. Of course, Marcus said, rising from the table with the same easy confidence he had arrived with. I understand this is a significant decision, but I would encourage you not to take too long. Opportunities like this do not remain available indefinitely, and the longer Damian Cole is given to stabilize his position, the harder it becomes to correct the imbalance his choices have created. He left a small card on the table before departing, a simple number without any identifying information beyond his name, and Elena sat alone afterward, staring at the card with a growing sense of unease. Whatever Marcus Cade actually wanted from Blackthorn's instability, she doubted it had anything to do with genuine concern for her well-being or her family's standing. He was using her pain as a tool, the same way her father had tried to use her marriage as a tool, and the realization left her feeling more exhausted than tempted. Still, she pocketed the card rather than discarding it, telling herself she simply wanted to keep her options open, though some quieter part of her recognized the danger in even that small concession. She drove home that afternoon with Marcus's proposal circling through her mind, weighed against the growing awareness that whatever choice she made next would carry consequences far beyond her own personal grievances. That evening, as she sat alone in her room turning the small card over in her hands, her phone rang with a call from her father, his voice carrying the particular sharpness he used when pack business required immediate attention. There is a rumor circulating, Victor said without preamble, that Marcus Cade has been making inquiries about our family's situation. Has he approached you directly? Elena hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to a father whose interest in her well-being had proven so conditional on strategic value. He spoke with me briefly this afternoon, she admitted finally. He suggested some kind of alliance against Damian. Victor's silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Elena wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, he spoke again, his voice carrying a warning edge she had rarely heard from him before. Whatever Marcus Cade proposed, Elena, I need you to understand the danger of involving yourself in that man's ambitions. He has spent years seeking any excuse to weaken Blackthorn's position along our shared border. If he is reaching out to you now, it is not out of sympathy. It is because he sees an opportunity to use our family's humiliation as a weapon. The warning, coming from her father of all people, struck Elena as almost darkly ironic, given his own willingness to weaponize her situation for compensation and strategic advantage just days earlier. Still, something in his tone carried genuine concern this time, a fear that reached beyond mere calculation. What would you have me do? Elena asked. Stay away from him, Victor said firmly. Whatever grievance you carry against Damian Cole, do not let Marcus Cade turn it into something that could plunge this entire region into conflict. That is not a path either of us wants to walk, regardless of how satisfying revenge might feel in this moment. Elena promised to consider his warning, though as she ended the call and looked again at the small card still resting in her palm, she felt the weight of a decision that would shape far more than her own personal future. Whatever she chose in the coming days, the consequences would ripple outward, touching lives far beyond her own, in ways she was only beginning to understand. The divisions within Blackthorn came to a head a few days later, during a public gathering held in the central square, an event originally planned months earlier to celebrate the harvest season, but which had inevitably become a stage for the pack's ongoing tensions. Elena attended reluctantly, more out of habit than genuine desire, having grown up expected to appear at such events as part of her family's standing within the community. The square buzzed with an uneasy energy from the moment she arrived, small clusters of pack members speaking in hushed tones, glancing toward the raised platform where Damien was expected to make brief remarks marking the start of the celebration. Elena positioned herself near the edge of the crowd, hoping to avoid drawing attention to herself, though she noticed several pairs of eyes tracking her presence regardless. When Damien finally took the platform, flanked by a few members of his household staff, the crowd's murmuring quieted only partially. He began his remarks with the usual pleasantries expected of such occasions, thanking the pack for their resilience through a difficult harvest season, acknowledging the hard work of farmers and laborers who had kept the territory fed through leaner months. It was during the brief pause after his opening remarks that a voice called out from somewhere near the back of the crowd, sharp and clearly audible despite the general noise of the gathering. Will the Omega be joining us today, or does she still not know how to address a crowd this size? The question, delivered with obvious mockery, drew scattered laughter from some quarters and sharp, disapproving looks from others. Elena could not identify who had spoken, but she saw Damien's expression tighten almost imperceptibly before he responded. Ren is continuing her preparations privately, he said, his voice carrying the measured calm of someone determined not to let provocation derail the event. She will make her presence known to the pack when she and I both feel the time is appropriate. Convenient, another voice muttered, though quieter this time, less certain of the safety and speaking openly. A woman near the front, one of the younger pack members Elena vaguely recognized as working within the pack's medical hall, spoke up in response, her tone carrying obvious frustration. Perhaps if we gave her the chance to prepare without half the pack waiting to mock her first appearance, she might actually succeed. The exchange sparked a ripple of arguing voices throughout the crowd, some defending Ren's right to a fair chance, others insisting that an unranked Omega had no business being given special consideration regardless of any fated bond. Elena watched the scene unfold with a strange, detached fascination, recognizing that this small public square had become a microcosm of the exact tensions dividing the entire pack territory. Harold Ferris, standing near the platform among the other elders, finally raised a hand for quiet, his authority still commanding enough to settle the crowd's rising volume. "This is neither the time nor the place for this discussion," he said firmly. "The council's observation period continues as agreed. Judgments will be made based on merit, not on gossip exchanged in a public square." The crowd settled reluctantly, though the underlying tension remained palpable even as Damien continued his remarks, moving quickly through the remaining formalities of the harvest celebration. Elena found herself unable to fully focus on the rest of his speech, her mind circling back instead to the strange sensation of watching a community she had grown up within tear itself into competing factions over a situation she had once believed centered entirely on her own humiliation. It was becoming increasingly clear, standing in that square, that the consequences of Damien's choice extended far beyond her personal heartbreak. An entire pack now stood divided, uncertain of its own values, uncertain whether tradition or instinct deserved greater weight in matters of leadership and loyalty. Elena had spent the past weeks viewing herself as the primary victim of the wedding's collapse, but watching the crowd argue and splinter before her, she began to understand that the ripples of that single afternoon had grown into something far larger than any one person's grievance. As the gathering began to disperse, Elena noticed Grace Whitfield, the advisor she had heard was working with Ren, standing near the edge of the platform observing the crowd's reaction with a thoughtful, calculating expression. Their eyes met briefly across the square, and something passed between them, not quite recognition, but perhaps a shared understanding that both women now occupied positions shaped entirely by decisions made by men who had not fully considered the consequences. Elena left the gathering earlier than most, walking back toward her car with Marcus Cade's small card still tucked away in her bag, the weight of the decision it represented growing heavier with each passing day. Whatever choice she made about Marcus's proposed alliance, she understood now that the stakes reached far beyond her own wounded pride, touching the stability of an entire pack territory, already fracturing under the weight of divided loyalties. 3 days after the harvest gathering, Elena finally reached a decision, though not the one Marcus Cade was likely hoping for. She had spent those days turning the small white card over in her hands more times than she could count, weighing her father's warning against her own lingering desire to see Damien face some measure of accountability for the humiliation he had caused her. In the end, it was not her father's warning that swayed her, but a quieter, more persistent thought that had been growing since the moment she watched the pack argue and splinter in the central square. Whatever grievance she carried against Damien, she did not want to be responsible for plunging an entire territory into conflict simply to satisfy her own wounded pride. That was not the kind of legacy she wanted, regardless of how tempting Marcus's offer of consequence and compensation had initially seemed. But before formally declining his proposal, Elena found herself drawn toward a decision that surprised her more than any other choice she had made since the wedding. She wanted to speak with Ren directly, not to confront her, not to demand explanations, but simply to understand, firsthand, the person at the center of this entire upheaval, rather than relying on second-hand accounts and rumor. She arrived at the small house in the lower quarter on a quiet afternoon, having gathered the address through a brief, awkward conversation with Ruth Bellamy at the shop, where she had first inquired about Ren weeks earlier. Standing at the front door, Elena hesitated, uncertain whether this visit would prove to be wisdom or foolishness, before finally knocking. The door opened to reveal Ren herself, dressed simply, her expression shifting rapidly from polite curiosity to visible shock as she recognized her unexpected visitor. For a long moment neither woman spoke, the weight of everything that had happened between them, however unintentionally, hanging heavy in the space separating them. "Miss Voss," Ren finally managed, her voice carrying obvious surprise. "I did not expect to see you here." "I imagine not," Elena said, feeling suddenly uncertain now that she stood face to face with the woman who had unknowingly ended her engagement. "May I come in? I promise I have not come to cause any trouble." Ren hesitated only briefly before stepping aside, gesturing Elena into the modest front room of the house. Constance appeared from the kitchen doorway, her expression carrying obvious alarm at the unexpected guest, though Ren offered a small, reassuring gesture that seemed to settle her aunt's concerns enough to allow the visit to continue. "I will leave you two to talk," Constance said carefully, retreating back toward the kitchen, though remaining within easy earshot should anything go wrong. Elena seated herself where Ren indicated, studying the younger woman across from her with a curiosity that had been building for weeks. Up close, without the chaos of the ceremonial hall surrounding them, Ren looked even younger than Elena remembered, her posture still carrying the particular tension of someone constantly bracing for judgment. "I have spent the past weeks trying to hate you," Elena said finally, deciding honesty was likely the only useful approach for this strange, unplanned meeting. "It would have been easier in some ways, to simply hate you and move forward with that anger as my guide." Ren's expression tightened, though she did not look away. "I understand if you do hate me. I would probably feel the same way, in your position." "That is the thing," Elena said. "I do not think I actually hate you. I have tried, but every time I attempt to build that anger into something solid, I keep coming back to the fact that you looked just as frightened and overwhelmed as I felt that day. You did not orchestrate this. You did not choose to disrupt my wedding out of ambition or cruelty." "No," Ren said quietly. "I did not choose any of this. I have spent every day since trying to understand how my entire life changed so completely, because of something I never asked for, never sought, and honestly never wanted." The admission carried a rawness that Elena recognized immediately, the same disorientation she herself had felt since the ceremony ended, the sense of a life reshaped entirely by forces beyond one's own control. "The council has given you 3 months, Elena said. "How is that going, if you do not mind my asking?" Ren let out a short, humorless laugh. "Difficult. Grace Whitfield is teaching me everything I apparently need to know about pack governance, protocol, council structure, all of it condensed into a timeline that feels impossible most days. Half the pack seems to be waiting for me to fail, and the other half seems uncertain whether they even want me to succeed. I saw some of that division myself," Elena admitted, "at the harvest gathering a few days ago. It has become something larger than either of us anticipated, I think." "I know," Ren said, her expression troubled. "I never wanted to be the cause of that kind of conflict. I keep wondering if it would have been better for everyone if Damien had simply ignored the bond entirely and married you as planned." The statement surprised Elena more than she expected, coming as it did from the person who now stood to gain everything from the situation as it currently existed. "You would have preferred that, even knowing what it would have meant, denying a fated bond for the rest of your life?" Ren considered the question carefully before answering. "I do not know, honestly. Some days I think it would have been easier, simpler, to remain invisible the way I always was before this happened. Other days I recognize that denying something as significant as a fated bond carries its own kind of cruelty, both toward Damien and toward whoever he might have married instead, someone who would have spent a lifetime with a husband only half present because his instincts pulled him elsewhere." The words echoed something Damien himself had said during the confrontation in the ceremonial hall weeks earlier, and Elena found herself surprised by how much sense the reasoning made, even filtered through the lens of her own personal loss. "I have thought about that too," she admitted. "As much as it hurts to acknowledge, I do not think I would have wanted a husband who was only partially committed to our marriage, even if I never knew the reason why. They sat together in silence for a long moment, the strange, unlikely understanding building between them despite everything that separated their circumstances. Finally, Elena spoke again, deciding the moment called for full honesty regardless of the risk it carried. "I have been approached by Marcus Cade," she said. "He wants my help destabilizing Damien's position, using our situation, yours and mine, as leverage against Blackthorn's leadership." Wren's expression shifted immediately to alarm. "That sounds dangerous. Marcus Cade has always sought excuses to weaken Blackthorn's border territories. My aunt has mentioned him before, though I never expected to hear his name connected to something like this." "I have decided to decline his offer," Elena said. "Whatever anger I still carry toward Damien, I do not want to be responsible for the kind of conflict Marcus seems intent on creating. But I wanted you to know he approached me, in case it matters for whatever protective measures you and Damien might need to consider." Wren's expression softened into something like genuine gratitude. "Thank you for telling me. I know you did not have to." "No," Elena agreed, "I did not. But sitting here with you now, I find it difficult to imagine using your situation, or mine, as a weapon for someone else's political ambitions. Whatever happens between the two of us going forward, I would rather it be resolved honestly than manipulated by outside interests looking to profit from our misfortune." The visit continued for a while longer, the conversation gradually softening from cautious formality into something closer to genuine, if unlikely, understanding. By the time Elena finally rose to leave, she found herself surprised by how much her perspective had shifted since arriving at the small house in the lower quarter that afternoon. "For what it is worth," Elena said at the door, "I hope the council's observation period goes well for you." "I did not expect to say that, given everything that happened, but I find that I mean it." Wren offered a small, genuine smile, the first Elena had seen from her since their conversation began. "Thank you. And for what it is worth, I am sorry, truly sorry, for the pain my presence caused you, even though I never intended it." Elena nodded, accepting the apology with more grace than she expected to feel capable of, and made her way back to her car, the weight of Marcus Cade's proposal feeling considerably lighter now that she understood more fully who Wren actually was, beneath the rumors and the public spectacle that had defined her since the wedding's collapse. She drove home that evening with a clearer sense of direction than she had felt since the ceremony ended, resolved to formally decline Marcus's offer and to find her own path forward, one built on something more solid than revenge against a man who had, in his own flawed way, simply tried to be honest about a connection neither he nor Wren had ever sought. The following morning, Elena called the number on the small white card, half expecting to reach some assistant or intermediary, rather than Marcus himself. Instead, his voice answered on the second ring, smooth and expectant, as though he had been waiting for her call since the moment he handed her the card. "Miss Voss," he said, "I hope you have had sufficient time to consider my proposal." "I have," Elena said, keeping her voice steady despite the nervousness building in her chest. "And I have decided to decline. I do not wish to be part of any effort to destabilize Blackthorn's leadership, regardless of my personal grievances against Damien Cole." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Elena wondered if the call had disconnected. When Marcus finally spoke again, his tone had shifted subtly, the smooth confidence replaced by something harder, more calculating. "That is disappointing to hear," he said. "I had hoped you would recognize the value of the opportunity I offered, particularly given how poorly your own family has been treated throughout this entire situation." "My family's treatment is not your concern," Elena said, feeling a flash of irritation at his continued insistence on framing this as some kind of favor to her. "I appreciate that you see an opportunity in Blackthorn's current instability, but I will not be the one who provides you the means to exploit it." "I see," Marcus said, his voice carrying a chill that had not been present during their earlier meeting. "I suppose I misjudged how much resentment you were actually carrying toward Damien Cole. Perhaps the humiliation was not as significant as I assumed." "Do not mistake my decision for a lack of resentment," Elena said sharply. "I simply refuse to let that resentment be weaponized by someone whose interest in me has never been anything beyond strategic convenience." Another pause followed, longer this time, and when Marcus spoke again, his tone had returned to something closer to its earlier smoothness, though Elena could hear the underlying edge still present beneath the surface. "Very well, Miss Voss. I respect your decision, even if I find it short-sighted. I hope, for your family's sake, that you do not come to regret choosing loyalty to a pack that has shown you so little consideration in return." The call ended shortly after, leaving Elena standing alone in her room with an uneasy feeling settling in her chest that she could not quite name. Something in Marcus's final words carried more warning than simple disappointment, a suggestion that his interest in Blackthorn's instability would not simply disappear because she had declined to participate directly. She mentioned the conversation to her mother later that day, hoping perhaps to ease the unease still lingering from the call, though Charlotte's reaction only deepened her concern rather than easing it. "Marcus Cade does not accept refusal easily," Charlotte said, her expression troubled. "I have heard stories over the years, nothing confirmed, but enough to suggest he pursues his ambitions through whatever means prove necessary, regardless of who declines to assist him directly." "You think he will find another way to act against Blackthorn?" Elena asked. "I think," Charlotte said carefully, "that a man like Marcus Cade rarely reveals his full intentions during a single conversation over tea. Whatever he actually wants from Blackthorn's instability, I doubt your refusal has changed his underlying plans, only perhaps the specific method he intends to use pursuing them." The conversation left Elena with a persistent sense of unease that lingered throughout the following days, a quiet suspicion that declining Marcus's offer had not fully removed her, or Blackthorn, from whatever calculations he was making regarding the pack's current vulnerabilities. She found herself watching the news more carefully, listening more attentively to conversations at the market about tensions along the eastern border, wondering whether the peace of recent weeks was simply the calm before something far more dangerous began to unfold. Nearly 2 months into the council's observation period, the first real signs of trouble began appearing along Blackthorn's eastern border. Reports reached Damien's household of unusual activity near the boundary line, patrol schedules disrupted, small groups of unfamiliar wolves spotted moving through territory that had remained quiet for years. Damien dismissed the initial reports as minor border disputes, the kind of small territorial friction that occasionally flared between neighboring packs without escalating into anything serious. He should have paid closer attention. The pattern became harder to ignore as the days passed. A supply caravan traveling between Blackthorn's outer settlements was delayed by what was reported as an unexpected obstruction on the main trade route. Though when patrol officers investigated, they found evidence suggesting the obstruction had been deliberately placed. A grain storage facility near the border experienced an unexplained fire that damaged a portion of the pack's harvest reserves, officially attributed to faulty equipment, though whispers among the workers suggested otherwise. Damien called an emergency council meeting once the pattern became too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, gathering the same elders who had presided over Wren's observation period weeks earlier. Harold Ferris, usually the most skeptical voice regarding Wren's suitability, appeared genuinely troubled by the reports laid out before the council. "These incidents began roughly around the same time as the wedding disruption," Harold observed, studying the compiled reports with a furrowed brow. "I do not believe that timing is coincidental." "You think someone is deliberately exploiting our internal divisions," Damien said, the realization settling over him with uncomfortable clarity. "I think," Harold said, "that any competent rival alpha watching Blackthorn's leadership fracture over a broken engagement would recognize an opportunity too valuable to ignore. Our patrols have been distracted by internal disputes. Our resources have been diverted toward managing political tension rather than territorial security. This is precisely the kind of vulnerability an ambitious neighbor would exploit." Damien's mind immediately went to Marcus Cade, whose territory bordered Blackthorn's eastern edge, whose reputation for opportunistic ambition had circulated through pack politics for years. He had not previously considered Marcus a direct threat, assuming the man's ambitions remained focused on smaller territorial disputes rather than anything approaching outright conflict. That assumption now felt dangerously naive. "We need to increase patrol presence along the eastern border immediately," Damien said. "And I want confirmation on whether Marcus Cade's forces have been observed anywhere near these incidents." The council authorized increased security measures, though the damage from weeks of distracted leadership had already begun accumulating, in ways that would take considerable effort to reverse. Damien left the meeting with a growing sense of dread, aware that his personal choices regarding Wren had created ripples reaching far beyond the pack's internal politics, potentially exposing Blackthorn's entire territory to external threat. He found Wren later that evening in the small study where Grace Whitfield had been conducting her lessons, poring over documents related to pack resource management, her expression tired but determined, despite the long hours of study she had endured over the past 2 months. "There is a situation developing along the eastern border," Damien said, seating himself across from her. "I believe Marcus Cade may be exploiting the division within our pack to weaken our territorial defenses." Wren looked up sharply, alarm crossing her features. Elena mentioned Marcus approached her weeks ago, seeking an alliance against you. She declined, but she seemed genuinely concerned about how he might react to her refusal. She never told me this, Damien said, surprised by the revelation. She told me instead, Ren said. During a visit she made here, to the lower quarter, some weeks back. I should have mentioned it to you sooner, but I did not fully understand the significance until now. Damien absorbed this information with growing unease, recognizing that Marcus's ambitions had likely been building for far longer than the recent border incidents suggested. If Elena had already declined his direct approach, it stood to reason he had simply pivoted toward exploiting the pack's internal chaos through more indirect means, using the general instability as cover for whatever territorial gains he hoped to achieve. I need to speak with Elena directly, Damien said. If Marcus approached her with specific intentions, she may have information that could help us understand exactly what he is planning. Ren nodded, though her expression carried obvious concern. Be careful, Damien. If Marcus is willing to escalate to actual incursions along the border, he may not stop at diplomatic maneuvering if he feels cornered. Damien arranged a meeting with Elena the following day, choosing neutral ground away from either family's estate to avoid drawing unnecessary attention to the conversation. Elena arrived looking wary, uncertain why the Alpha King had suddenly requested her presence after weeks of careful distance between them. I understand Marcus Cade approached you some weeks ago, Damien said without preamble, deciding directness was the most efficient path given the urgency of the situation. I need to know everything he said, everything he proposed, and how he reacted when you declined. Elena's expression shifted from confusion to understanding as she registered the seriousness in Damien's tone. You think this connects to the border incidents I have been hearing rumors about? I believe it does, Damien said. Please, tell me everything you remember. Elena recounted the details of her meeting with Marcus, his proposal for an alliance built on shared grievance, his veiled warning during their final phone conversation when she declined his offer. Damien listened carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim as the picture assembled itself into something far more dangerous than simple political opportunism. You mentioned that I might regret choosing loyalty to a pack that showed me little consideration, Elena said, recalling the conversation with unsettling clarity. At the time, I assumed it was simply an attempt to guilt me into reconsidering. Now I wonder if it was something closer to an actual threat. It very likely was, Damien said. If Marcus has been planning to exploit our internal divisions regardless of whether you agreed to help him, your refusal may have simply accelerated whatever timeline he had already established for more direct action. The weight of this realization settled heavily between them, the personal drama of the wedding's collapse suddenly overshadowed by the far more serious threat of a rival alpha preparing to exploit Blackthorn's weakened state for territorial gain. Elena felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over her, wondering if her initial willingness to even consider Marcus's proposal had somehow contributed to the escalating danger now facing the pack. I should have told you about his approach sooner, she said. I mentioned it to Ren, but I did not think to bring it directly to your attention given everything else happening at the time. You could not have known how significant it would become, Damien said, though his tone carried no real comfort given the gravity of the unfolding situation. What matters now is preparing Blackthorn to defend itself, regardless of whatever Marcus is planning next. As if summoned by the conversation itself, Damien's phone rang moments later, an urgent call from one of his border patrol commanders, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm as he relayed information that confirmed everyone's worst suspicions. Marcus Cade's forces had been spotted mobilizing near the border in numbers far exceeding any reasonable justification for routine patrol activity, positioning themselves in ways that suggested imminent movement rather than simple posturing. Damien ended the call with his expression hardened into the focused determination of a leader facing genuine crisis. It has begun, he said, turning to Elena with grim resolve. Whatever personal grievances exist between us, between all of us, they will need to wait. Blackthorn is about to face a threat that requires everyone's full attention, regardless of past divisions. Elena nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment even as uncertainty about her own role in the unfolding crisis weighed heavily on her conscience. Whatever came next, the quiet drama of a broken engagement had transformed into something with consequences reaching far beyond personal heartbreak, threatening the safety and stability of the entire pack territory she had grown up within. Within hours, Blackthorn's estate transformed into a hub of urgent activity. Patrol leaders arrived to receive updated orders, messengers moved swiftly between the council chamber and outlying settlements, and Damien found himself coordinating a defense strategy with the same intensity he had once reserved for managing the political fallout of his broken engagement. The irony was not lost on him. that the very chaos he had caused through following his fated bond had now been overshadowed entirely by an external threat far more dangerous than any internal pack dispute. Grace Whitfield appeared at his side as the preparations continued, her expression grave despite decades of experience navigating pack crises. "The council needs a unified front right now," she said quietly. "Elders and pack members alike need to see leadership that has moved past its internal divisions, at least for the duration of this threat." "I understand," Damien said, "but unity will require more than simply declaring it. People need reason to trust that this pack can stand together despite everything that has happened these past 2 months." Grace's gaze shifted meaningfully toward the doorway, where Wren had just appeared, still dressed in the simple clothing she had worn for her earlier lessons, her expression a mixture of determination and barely concealed fear. "Perhaps this crisis offers an unexpected opportunity," Grace said. "A chance for her to prove herself in a way that no amount of council observation could replicate." Damien considered the suggestion carefully, recognizing both its wisdom and its risk. Asking Wren to step into a visible role during a genuine territorial crisis carried enormous danger, both to her personal safety and to the fragile trust still being built between her and the wider pack. But it also offered the clearest possible demonstration of whether she truly possessed the capability the council's observation period was meant to assess. He crossed the room to speak with her directly, keeping his voice low despite the surrounding activity. "Marcus Cade's forces are mobilizing along the border," he said. "This is no longer a political dispute. It is a genuine threat to Blackthorn's safety, and I need people I trust helping coordinate our response." Wren's expression flickered with uncertainty before settling into something steadier. "What do you need from me?" "Grace has been teaching you resource management and logistics these past weeks," Damien said. "I need someone coordinating supply distribution to our defensive positions, while the patrol commanders focus entirely on strategy and border security. It is not a glamorous role, but it is essential, and I believe you are capable of managing it effectively." Wren nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the responsibility being offered to her. "I will not let you down," she said, though her voice carried the particular determination of someone who understood exactly how much rode on her performance over the coming hours and days. As she moved to begin coordinating with the estate's logistics staff, Damien watched her go with a complicated mixture of pride and worry, aware that whatever happened next would shape not only the outcome of this immediate crisis, but also the wider question of whether Blackthorn's pack could ultimately accept her as their future Luna, tested now not through careful observation, but through the harsh, unforgiving demands of genuine emergency. The following 2 days passed in a blur of urgent activity, as Blackthorn mobilized its full defensive capacity along the eastern border. Damien spent most of his waking hours coordinating with patrol commanders, reviewing intelligence reports, and communicating with neighboring pack territories, who might be willing to offer support should Marcus Cade's incursion escalate into something requiring broader intervention. Wren, meanwhile, found herself immersed in logistics work far more demanding than anything Grace Whitfield's lessons had prepared her for in theory. Coordinating supply distribution across multiple defensive positions required constant attention to detail, rapid decision-making under pressure, and the ability to manage a growing team of volunteers and staff who had never previously worked under an Omega's direction. The early hours were rough. Several staff members initially resisted taking direction from her, deferring instead to more senior members of the household despite Damien's explicit instructions that Wren's authority over logistics should be respected during the crisis. She handled the friction with a patience that surprised even herself, addressing concerns directly rather than retreating from confrontation, gradually earning grudging respect from those who had expected her to falter under pressure. By the second day, a supply shortage threatened to leave one of the northern defensive positions without adequate provisions, a crisis that could have significantly weakened Blackthorn's ability to hold that section of the border. Wren identified the problem hours before it would have become critical, reorganizing distribution routes and redirecting reserves from a less vulnerable position to compensate for the shortfall. The solution was not elegant, but it was effective, and it prevented what could have become a serious tactical vulnerability during an already precarious situation. Harold Ferris, who had positioned himself at the estate to oversee council coordination during the crisis, observed Wren's handling of the supply situation with an expression that gradually shifted from skepticism to something closer to reluctant respect. He said nothing directly to her during those early days, but Damien noticed the elder's demeanor softening incrementally as reports of Wren's competent management continued reaching the council. The actual confrontation along the border, when it finally came, proved less catastrophic than the tense days of preparation had suggested it might become. Marcus Cade's forces, faced with a Blackthorn patrol far better organized and provisioned than his intelligence had apparently anticipated, engaged in a brief and largely unsuccessful attempt to press into contested territory near the border's northern edge. Damien's patrol commanders, working with information Wren's logistics coordination had helped keep flowing smoothly, managed to repel the incursion with minimal losses on either side. Word of the successful defense reached the estate by evening, and Damien felt a wave of relief wash over him that he had not fully realized he was holding back until the tension finally eased. He found Wren still coordinating supply reports in the small office she had claimed as her temporary headquarters during the crisis, her expression exhausted but carrying an unmistakable sense of accomplishment. "The border held," he said, watching her reaction carefully. Marcus's forces withdrew after the initial confrontation failed to gain any meaningful ground. Wren's shoulders sagged with visible relief, some of the tension of the past 2 days finally releasing from her posture. "I was so worried we would not have enough supplies reaching the northern position in time," she admitted. "I kept running the numbers over and over, terrified I had miscalculated something critical." "You did not," Damien said. "Whatever you managed these past 2 days, it made a genuine difference in how effectively our patrols were able to respond. I do not think the outcome would have been the same without your work coordinating everything behind the scenes." Harold Ferris arrived at the office doorway as Damien spoke, his expression carrying none of the skepticism that had characterized his interactions with Wren since the very beginning of the observation period. "I have reviewed the reports from the northern position," he said, addressing Wren directly for the first time without obvious reluctance. "Your logistics work prevented what could have become a significant tactical failure. I will not pretend I expected this level of competence from you 2 months ago, but I am willing to acknowledge when I have been proven wrong." The acknowledgement, coming from the pack's most vocal traditionalist, carried weight far beyond its simple wording. Wren accepted it with visible surprise, unsure how to respond to praise from someone who had spent the past 2 months treating her presence as an unwelcome disruption to proper pack order. "Thank you," she said finally. "I only did what needed to be done. I am glad it made a difference." "It made considerably more difference than you may realize," Harold said. "The Council will need to reconvene to discuss the implications of these events, both for our border security going forward, and for the observation period we established regarding your potential position as Luna." After Harold departed, Damien turned back to Wren, studying her with an expression that carried both pride and lingering exhaustion from the demanding days behind them. "This changes things," he said quietly. "Perhaps not everything, but something significant, I think, in how the Council views your suitability for the role we discussed." "I did not do this to prove anything to the Council," Wren said. "I did it because Blackthorn needed help, and I happened to be in a position to provide it." "I know," Damien said, "but sometimes the most genuine demonstrations of capability come precisely from moments when proving oneself was never the primary goal." Elsewhere in the estate, Elena had followed news of the crisis with a complicated mixture of relief and lingering guilt, aware that her initial contact with Marcus Cade, however brief and ultimately declined, had likely factored into whatever calculations led him toward this attempted incursion. She had spent the tense days of preparation offering what assistance she could to her own family's resources, coordinating with local suppliers who maintained relationships with Blackthorn's defensive network, determined to contribute something positive to counterbalance whatever role her earlier hesitation might have played in the unfolding crisis. When word reached her that the border had held and Marcus's forces had withdrawn, she felt a wave of relief that surprised her with its intensity. Whatever remained of her personal grievances against Damien and Wren, she recognized now that the safety of the entire pack mattered more than any lingering resentment over her broken engagement, a realization that had been building steadily since her visit to Wren's home weeks earlier. The following days brought a strange, cautious calm to Blackthorn territory, the immediate crisis resolved even as its longer-term implications continued unfolding. The Council met repeatedly to discuss both the security lessons learned from Marcus's failed incursion and the unexpected demonstration of capability Wren had provided during the emergency. Harold Ferris, once the most vocal skeptic regarding her suitability, now found himself advocating cautiously for accelerating the timeline of her formal acceptance, arguing that the crisis had provided evidence far more compelling than months of careful observation might have offered under normal circumstances. Damien, watching these developments unfold, allowed himself a rare moment of genuine hope regarding the future, both for his relationship with Wren and for the wider stability of the pack he had inadvertently thrown into chaos through following his fated bond. The road ahead remained uncertain, the wounds of recent months not fully healed, but for the first time since the disastrous wedding ceremony, The path forward seemed to carry more promise than peril. That cautious hope proved premature. 2 days after the border confrontation, one of Damien's patrol commanders arrived at the estate carrying intelligence that dampened the relief still settling over the pack. Marcus Cade's forces had not simply retreated after their failed incursion. Scouts positioned along the border reported the rival Alpha regrouping his forces at a staging point several miles beyond Blackthorn's territory, gathering numbers that suggested the earlier confrontation had been a probing effort rather than his primary strategy. "He is testing our defenses," the commander explained, spreading a rough map across the council table. "The initial push told him where our strongest positions are located, and more importantly, where our weaknesses remain. I believe he intends a second, more coordinated effort, likely targeting a different section of the border where our response proved slower during the first engagement." Damien studied the map grimly, recognizing the tactical logic behind the commander's assessment. Marcus had never intended a single skirmish to succeed outright. He had used it to gather information, the same way he had used Elena's brief consideration of his proposal to gauge Blackthorn's internal vulnerabilities before committing to more direct action. "How much time do we have before he moves again?" Damien asked. "Difficult to say precisely," the commander admitted. "Days, most likely, rather than weeks. He will not want to give us too much time to reinforce the weaknesses his scouts have already identified." The council meeting that followed carried a different tenor than the earlier crisis response, less immediate panic and more grim, methodical planning for a threat that everyone now understood would require more than a single successful defense to fully resolve. Harold Ferris, still adjusting to his newfound respect for Wren's capabilities, suggested that her logistics coordination would prove even more critical during a second engagement, one where Blackthorn's forces needed to respond with greater speed and precision than the first confrontation had demanded. "We need better intelligence about exactly where he intends to strike," Damien said, addressing the assembled commanders and elders. "Without that, we are simply guessing which sections of the border to reinforce, and guessing incorrectly could prove costly." It was a problem without an obvious solution, at least not one immediately apparent to anyone gathered around the council table that evening. As the meeting dispersed and preparations continued for whatever Marcus intended next, Damien found himself wondering whether the connections Elena had briefly formed with Marcus Cade, however reluctantly, might yet prove useful in understanding the rival Alpha's true intentions before it was too late to prepare adequately for whatever came next. Elena received Damien's message the following morning, an unusual and somewhat awkward request given everything that had transpired between them over the past 2 months. He asked, carefully and respectfully, whether she would be willing to help identify any details from her brief interactions with Marcus that might reveal his likely strategy for a renewed attack against Blackthorn's border. She agreed without hesitation, arriving at the estate later that day to find Damien and several of his patrol commanders gathered around the same map that had occupied their attention the previous evening. The atmosphere felt markedly different from her last visit, less personal confrontation and more urgent collaborative planning, the kind of shared purpose that temporarily set aside old grievances in favor of addressing a more pressing shared danger. "Tell us everything you remember about your conversations with Marcus," Damien said. "Even small details might prove significant, given how carefully he seems to plan his moves." Elena closed her eyes, pulling the memories into sharper focus than she had previously bothered to examine them. "He mentioned, during our first meeting, that he had been watching Blackthorn's border patrols for some time, studying patterns before approaching me. He seemed to already understand the general layout of your defensive positions, before I ever provided him with any information myself." "That matches what our scouts observed during the initial confrontation," one of the commanders noted. "He clearly had detailed knowledge of our positions before the first engagement began." "Did he mention any specific locations?" Damien asked. "Anywhere that seemed to hold particular significance in his planning." Elena thought carefully, trying to recall the exact wording of conversations that had felt significant at the time but had faded somewhat under the weight of everything that followed. "He spoke once about the southern trade routes, mentioning how vulnerable supply lines could determine the outcome of any extended conflict. I did not think much of it at the time, since our conversation was focused primarily on the political alliance he wanted me to consider." The commander studying the map immediately traced a finger along a section representing Blackthorn's southern border, an area that had received considerably less reinforcement than the northern position where the initial confrontation had occurred. "If he is targeting our supply routes rather than attempting direct territorial incursion, the southern trade path would represent a significant vulnerability, particularly given how much of our reinforcement has focused on the northern sector following the first engagement." Ren, who had joined the meeting partway through Elena's recollection, studied the map with the same careful attention she had brought to logistics coordination during the earlier crisis. If he intends to disrupt our supply routes rather than engage directly with our patrols, that suggests a strategy focused on gradual attrition rather than immediate confrontation. He may be hoping to weaken our resources over time, forcing concessions without requiring a decisive military engagement. That would match his broader pattern, Damien said grimly. Marcus has always preferred strategies that avoid direct, costly conflict, favoring instead approaches that exploit vulnerability through patience and calculated pressure. The meeting continued for another hour, gradually assembling a clearer picture of Marcus's likely intentions based on the fragments of information Elena provided, combined with the tactical assessments of Damien's commanders. By the time the discussion concluded, a revised defensive strategy had emerged, one focused specifically on reinforcing the southern supply routes while maintaining sufficient presence along the northern border to discourage any renewed direct confrontation there. As the meeting dispersed, Elena found herself lingering near the estate's entrance, uncertain whether her contribution had been sufficient given the gravity of what was at stake. Damien approached her before she could leave, his expression carrying genuine gratitude, despite the awkwardness that still lingered between them. "Thank you for coming today," he said. "I know this situation places you in an uncomfortable position, given everything that has happened between us. I would rather help than sit at home wondering whether my earlier hesitation with Marcus contributed to whatever happens next," Elena said honestly. "Whatever remains unresolved between us personally, I do not want to see this pack suffer because of choices I made, or nearly made, regarding his proposal." Damien nodded, studying her with an expression that carried more respect than she expected given the circumstances. "For what it is worth, I do not believe you bear responsibility for Marcus's actions. He was clearly planning this regardless of whether you agreed to help him directly. Your refusal likely only affected his timeline, not his underlying intentions." The reassurance offered some comfort, though Elena still carried a lingering unease as she drove home that evening, aware that the coming days would test Blackthorn's defenses in ways that could prove far more costly than the initial confrontation had suggested was possible. She spent the following days monitoring news from the border with an intensity that surprised even herself, checking regularly with contacts who maintained connections to the pack's defensive network, desperate for any indication of how the situation was developing. The renewed attack, when it finally came, targeted precisely the southern trade route Elena's information had helped identify as vulnerable. Marcus's forces attempted a coordinated effort to disrupt the supply corridor, hoping to catch Blackthorn's defenders unprepared, given the earlier focus on northern reinforcement. Instead, they found a defensive position considerably stronger than anticipated, Damien's commanders having redirected sufficient resources based on the intelligence Elena's recollections had helped assemble. The confrontation proved brief and decisive, Marcus's forces withdrawing after suffering losses that made clear the element of surprise he had been counting on had failed entirely. Word of the successful defense reached Elena by evening, and she felt a wave of relief that carried with it an unexpected sense of genuine accomplishment, the first she had experienced in months that felt entirely her own, rather than borrowed from expectations others had placed upon her. Her father called shortly after news of the successful defense spread, his voice carrying an unusual note of something that might have been pride, though colored still with his familiar calculating undertones. "I understand you provided information that helped Blackthorn anticipate Marcus's second attack," Victor said. "That reflects well on our family's standing, regardless of everything else that has happened." "I did not do it for the family's standing," Elena said, some of her earlier frustration with her father's priorities resurfacing despite the positive outcome. "I did it because it was the right thing to do, Father. Because I did not want to be responsible, even indirectly, for harm coming to people I have known my entire life." Victor was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his tone carried something closer to genuine reflection than his usual calculated assessment. "Perhaps that is a better reason than the ones I typically consider," he admitted. "You have shown more integrity through this entire situation than I fully credited you with, Elena. I am proud of how you have handled yourself, regardless of how difficult these past months have been." The acknowledgement, unexpected and imperfect as it was, carried more weight than Elena anticipated, a small but genuine step toward the kind of relationship with her father she had long ago stopped believing was possible. Whatever remained unresolved between them, this moment offered a fragile but real foundation for something better than the purely transactional dynamic that had defined their relationship for so long. Over the following days, as Blackthorn settled into a more secure peace with Marcus Cade's forces withdrawing entirely from the border region, the pack began to reassess not only its security posture, but also its understanding of the people who had navigated this crisis alongside them. Elena, once viewed primarily as the jilted bride left behind at a disastrous wedding, found herself regarded increasingly as someone whose genuine care for the pack's well-being had proven itself through action rather than mere sentiment. The transformation was neither instant nor complete, but it marked a meaningful shift in how her presence within Blackthorn's community was understood, no longer defined solely by her broken engagement, but by the choices she had made in its difficult aftermath. Grace Whitfield sought Elena out during this period of relative calm, appearing at her family's estate with an invitation that surprised Elena, given how little direct interaction they had shared previously. "The council would like to formally acknowledge your contribution to the recent border defense," Grace explained, seated across from Elena in the estate's modest sitting room. "Some among the elders believe your assistance deserves recognition beyond a simple private thank you." "I do not need public recognition," Elena said, somewhat taken aback by the suggestion. "I only did what seemed necessary given the circumstances." "Perhaps," Grace said, studying her with the same assessing gaze she had once turned on Ren during those early, uncertain lessons. "But sometimes public acknowledgement serves a purpose beyond simple gratitude. It helps a community understand who among them can be trusted during genuine crisis, separate from whatever personal dramas may have colored earlier perceptions." Elena considered this, recognizing the wisdom in Grace's reasoning, even as she remained uncertain about accepting formal recognition for actions she still viewed as simply the right thing to do, rather than any grand gesture deserving special attention. "I will consider it," she said finally. "But I do not want this to become something that reopens old wounds, for myself or for Ren, given how much both of our lives have already been scrutinized by this pack over these past months." "That is a fair concern," Grace said. "I will ensure whatever recognition occurs remains focused on the practical value of your contribution, rather than reigniting old debates about the wedding itself." The formal acknowledgement, when it eventually occurred during a modest council gathering days later, proved considerably less dramatic than Elena had feared. A brief but genuine statement of gratitude from Harold Ferris himself, delivered with none of the skepticism that had once characterized his interactions with both Elena and Ren throughout the preceding months. The pack, it seemed, was gradually learning to separate the personal drama of a broken wedding from the genuine character demonstrated by the people involved in its aftermath. A shift that offered Elena a small but meaningful sense of closure regarding a chapter of her life that had once threatened to define her entirely through humiliation rather than through her own choices and actions. The 3 months of the council's observation period drew to a close on a cool autumn afternoon. The same ceremonial hall that had witnessed Ren's unexpected introduction to pack politics, now prepared once again, this time for a gathering meant to formally decide her future as Luna of Blackthorn. Unlike the chaotic scene that had unfolded during the original wedding ceremony, this gathering carried an entirely different atmosphere, one of cautious anticipation rather than shock disruption. Ren stood near the front of the hall, dressed simply but elegantly in clothing that Grace Whitfield had helped her select, her posture carrying none of the frightened uncertainty that had characterized her presence during those early, chaotic days following the wedding's collapse. Months of preparation, tested severely by the crisis with Marcus Cade, had transformed her from a frightened bystander into someone capable of standing confidently before the pack's assembled elders and community members. Harold Ferris rose to address the gathering, his voice carrying the weight of formal authority, as he prepared to deliver the council's judgment regarding Ren's suitability for the role she had been unexpectedly thrust into months earlier. "When this observation period began," he said, addressing the assembled crowd, "many among us, myself included, held serious doubts about whether an Omega, with no formal training or political experience, could adequately fulfill the responsibilities required of a Luna." He paused, allowing his words to settle over the attentive crowd before continuing. "Those doubts were not unreasonable, given the unprecedented nature of the circumstances that brought Ren Ashford into this position. But over these past 3 months, she has demonstrated capability, integrity, and judgment that exceeded what any of us anticipated, culminating in her critical role coordinating our defense during Marcus Cade's attempted incursion along our eastern border." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, a marked contrast to the hostile whispers that had once followed Ren through the pack's streets during the earliest, most uncertain days of her observation period. Harold continued, his expression carrying genuine conviction rather than the reluctant tolerance he had once displayed. "The council has reached its decision," he said. "We formally recognize Ren Ashford as fit to serve as Luna of Blackthorn, standing beside Alpha King Damian Cole in leadership of this pack, with the full support and confidence of this council." The announcement drew a wave of applause and approving murmurs throughout the hall, a stark contrast to the shocked silence that had greeted the original disruption of Elena's wedding months earlier. Damien crossed the hall to stand beside Ren, his expression carrying genuine pride and relief as he took her hand in front of the assembled crowd, this time with the full support of the council, rather than the fractured, uncertain reception that had greeted their bond initially. "I know these past 3 months have not been easy," Damien said quietly, speaking only to Ren despite the crowd surrounding them. "But I could not be more proud of how you have handled every challenge placed before you." "I could not have done it without help," Ren said, her gaze drifting briefly toward Grace Whitfield, standing nearby with an expression of quiet satisfaction, and then toward the back of the hall where Elena stood among the gathered crowd, having accepted an invitation to witness the formal proceedings despite everything that had transpired between them. Elena caught Ren's gaze across the hall and offered a small, genuine smile, an acknowledgement of how far both their lives had traveled since that disastrous afternoon 3 months earlier. Whatever pain remained from watching her own wedding collapse so publicly, Elena had found, over these difficult months, a version of peace that came not from revenge or bitterness, but from choosing her own path forward rather than remaining trapped by the humiliation of a single afternoon. As the formal ceremony concluded and the hall began filling with the more relaxed conversation of a community gathering rather than a tense political proceeding, Elena found herself approached by her father, his expression carrying an unfamiliar softness that had been slowly developing since their conversation following the successful border defense. "I have been thinking," Victor said, "about what you told me weeks ago, regarding your reasons for helping with the border defense, about choosing to do what felt right, rather than what served the family's strategic interests." "And?" Elena asked, uncertain where this conversation was heading. "I believe I owe you an apology," Victor said, the words clearly difficult for a man unaccustomed to acknowledging his own shortcomings. "I spent so many years viewing your future purely in terms of strategic value to this family, that I failed to consider what you might actually want for yourself, separate from any alliance or arrangement I believed would benefit us collectively." Elena studied her father carefully, searching for any hint of calculated manipulation behind his words, finding instead what appeared to be genuine, if somewhat belated, reflection. "What are you suggesting exactly?" "I am suggesting," Victor said, "that perhaps it is time you consider what you actually want from your own future, rather than what this family or this pack expects of you. You have proven, these past months, that you possess judgment and integrity worth trusting. I would like to see you exercise that judgment in service of your own life, rather than simply in service of arrangements I might otherwise attempt to orchestrate on your behalf." The conversation marked a genuine shift in their relationship, imperfect and still developing, but meaningful in ways Elena had not expected to experience with a father who had spent so many years viewing her primarily through the lens of strategic value. She found herself considering, in the weeks that followed, what exactly she wanted her future to look like, separate from the identity of Luna she had once believed defined her entire purpose within Blackthorn's community. The answer, when it eventually came, surprised even Elena herself. She had spent so many years preparing for a role centered entirely around Blackthorn's pack politics that she had never fully considered what interests or ambitions might exist beyond that singular focus. Working alongside her family's suppliers during the border crisis had introduced her to aspects of resource management and community coordination that she found genuinely engaging, separate from any political marriage or pack title. She began exploring opportunities to formalize this interest, eventually establishing a small but growing operation focused on improving supply coordination between Blackthorn and its neighboring territories, work that drew on skills she had discovered during the crisis, while building something entirely her own rather than inherited through marriage or family expectation. The work carried none of the glamour associated with the title of Luna, but it offered something Elena had never previously experienced, a sense of purpose built entirely on her own choices rather than roles assigned to her by others. Months later, as the pack settled fully into its new configuration under Damien and Ren's joint leadership, Elena found herself reflecting on how completely her life had transformed since that disastrous afternoon at the altar. The humiliation that had once felt like the defining tragedy of her existence had gradually revealed itself as something closer to an unexpected beginning, painful and unwelcome in its arrival, but ultimately opening a path toward a life she might never have discovered had her original plans proceeded as originally intended. Ren, meanwhile, continued growing into her role as Luna with the same quiet determination that had carried her through the difficult observation period and the crisis with Marcus Cade. The pack's initial skepticism had not entirely disappeared, some traditionalist elements still occasionally questioning whether an unranked Omega truly belonged in such a position of authority, but the majority of Blackthorn's community had come to view her leadership with genuine respect, earned through demonstrated competence rather than granted through inherited status alone. Damien, for his part, found himself grateful daily for the fated bond that had disrupted his carefully planned wedding, recognizing in retrospect how close he had come to a lifetime bound to someone he could never have fully committed himself to, regardless of how politically advantageous that arrangement might have appeared. Whatever chaos his choice had initially caused, the pack had ultimately emerged stronger for it, its leadership tested and proven through genuine crisis, rather than simply assumed through tradition and expectation. On a quiet evening nearly a year after the original ceremony, Elena found herself once again standing near the ceremonial hall, though this time simply passing by rather than approaching for any formal occasion. She paused briefly, studying the building that had once represented the collapse of every plan she had carefully constructed for her future, and felt, for the first time since that difficult day, something closer to gratitude than grief. The wedding that never happened had cost her the future she once believed she wanted, but it had also given her the space to discover a future entirely her own, built on her own choices rather than arrangements orchestrated by others. Blackthorn Pack, once threatened by division and external danger, had emerged into a new order, one where an unranked Omega now stood as Luna beside her fated Alpha King, where a jilted bride had found unexpected purpose beyond the role she once believed defined her entire worth, and where an entire community had learned, through difficult and sometimes painful experience, that true strength came not from rigid adherence to tradition, but from the courage to embrace what proved genuine, however unexpected its arrival. As Elena continued walking toward her own growing enterprise, the setting sun casting long shadows across the pack territory she still called home, she allowed herself, finally, to feel at peace with a story that had begun with public humiliation, but had ultimately led her toward a life entirely of her own making, one she would not trade for any title or arrangement she had once believed represented the whole of her worth.